Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Dissidents and Dictators, the flagship podcast from the Human Rights Foundation. My name is Casey Michelle, and we have a special episode for you today, a little bit different than what we usually do. We are going to be speaking with a couple of the leading academics who are focused on the intersection of authoritarianism and public relations firms, dictatorships, and image management. We have Alexander Dukalskis from the University College Dublin and Adam Scharpf today from the University of Copenhagen talking about some of their recent groundbreaking work on this topic. So stick around because we have plenty of ground to cover. Alex and Adam, thanks so much for joining us today. Let me preface this by asking, where are you guys calling in from? We don't have you in studio today. Alex and Adam, where are you guys in the world right now?
So this is Alex. I'm calling in from Dublin, Ireland.
Hi, this is Adam, southern Germany, back home.
Well, thanks so much for joining us from, again, around the world today. Obviously, this research that you guys have been focusing on, that you recently published a paper on, which we're going to leave a link in the show notes for. Now, the title of this paper is Dictatorships and Western Public Relations Firms. This is not geographically limited. This is not one dictatorship in one region that you focused on. You looked at dictatorships around the world and how and why they are using Western PR firms for their own ends. I don't want to spoil too much of the paper. Obviously, this isn't something that I worked on, but as I said off mic, huge fan of this paper and your guys' work. Alex, I wanted to start with you. Can you share some of the top line findings of this paper, which was just published a few weeks ago?
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Casey. The first thing I suppose we should say is the paper's not, I suppose, technically published yet. It's what we in the business call a working paper. It means it hasn't been peer reviewed by a journal yet. We hope someday it will be, but these things take a long time. So we've kind of put it out there for consideration, which is pretty common practice. Basically, what we wanted to do is understand dictatorships using public relations firms, why they do it, under what conditions do they do it, and a little bit, does it work, right? Which is kind of the million-dollar question. Adam can talk a little bit more about the data that we gathered, which is super impressive. But basically, from 1945 until I think 2021 or 2022, we were able to capture all dictatorships using public relations firms in the United States. And it was a lot, more than 7,000 contracts. And, you might think it's sort of the sophisticated, kind of spin dictatorships or something, but it's all of them. And in fact, it's ones that are super egregious and violate human rights routinely. So we take that and we then drill down to think about and measure and test when and why dictatorships use public relations firms in the US. And during the course of that research, came across a number of funny but depressing contracts and stories.
You have to laugh, otherwise you cry.
Yeah, you have to. It's funny if it weren't so depressing. But maybe Adam can talk about the process of kind of getting all the data and the documents, because it was a really gargantuan task.
Yeah, Adam, we're talking about, and Alex, I think one of the stats that stood out on my end, you just mentioned a moment ago, 4 out of every 5 dictatorships, 80% of dictatorships post-1945, as you guys found, have hired in some form or fashion Western, in this case, American PR firms. Adam, how did you come across this data? What data sets were you using to put all this together?
Yeah, so we're bringing together several data sets here. A big chunk of information, and really like the core of the research we did here rests on and comes from the FERA data. So it's essentially the U.S. Department of Justice, under the Foreign Agents Registration Act that was put in place 1938. Requires essentially registration and disclosure from all individuals and organizations involved in political or advocacy activities on behalf of foreign entities. And we are using essentially all these registration data and link it up essentially with the dictatorships that are out there or that have been out there since 1945. And so we link this with a established data set that's produced by colleagues out at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And so we can essentially identify all the dictators that have been out there, are still out there, and see essentially in each year how many contracts with PR firms in the US did they essentially initiate. And that's essentially the core of our data set.
Right. And listeners may remember a few weeks ago, we talked about this Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is publicly available for any and all, and again, not just Americans, even though it is the United States Department of Justice. Adam, Alex, as you guys well know, and as you've obviously detailed in this paper, it's available to academics, to constituents that might be living under some of these dictatorships, and it's perfectly accessible from any computer sitting at home. Let me turn now to the findings of the paper itself. It's not just the scope, right? The 80% of all dictatorships, and as Alex, you mentioned just a moment ago, I mean, not just these nominally or supposedly savvy ones, which who knows, maybe some of these PR firms are involved in plumping up that image for some of these regimes as more savvy than others. What stood out to you in terms of why it is these dictatorships are doing? I mean, look, they're spending their own money. They must think they're getting something in return. Why is it that these dictatorships, either theoretically or even in practice, why are they hiring these firms?
Yeah, so I think a big part of it is that these firms provide access to audiences that the government otherwise wouldn't have access to. So, they can tell their side of the story and influence people that they want to influence. These PR firms are often staffed by professionals, and we can talk more about kind of the ethics of that business a little bit later if you want. But they're well-connected people who do this for a living, so they provide a service. They're a professional intermediary between in this case, American audiences and the dictatorship. So, we developed, a couple different kind of logics for why they might do this, but in real simple terms, you could imagine a dictatorship represses a nonviolent movement or something, and then they want to do damage control, so they hire a PR firm. You can imagine they're doing something that they really want to highlight. A classic case is like a sports tournament, the World Cup or the Olympics or something, and they really want to show, that they're this amazing, technologically advanced, democratic, peace-loving country, and so they hire a PR firm. And this, we should note, it's not new, obviously, right? So Adam has a great paper, a different project on the 1978 World Cup in Argentina, which was, the military junta there hired PR firms. So it's not new, but it also hasn't gone away. So the 2022 Olympics, the Winter Olympics in China, the Chinese consulate in New York hired a media relations firm to in turn hire or contract with influencers, online influencers, to promote the Olympics. And they made a formula, right, for how much content should be of what type. And a lot of it was sports content, just promoting the Olympics, pretty normal advertising stuff. But 20% of it was good things about U.S.-China relations, good things that China's doing in kind of the energy sphere or other, industrial development or other things. So, this is both old and new and evolving. And so the methods are going along with it.
Well, and again, if we get back to something like the Foreign Agents Registration Act itself, that goes back to the 1930s when regimes, certainly in Berlin under the Nazis, but also Mussolini's Rome, and even the Soviets were going to, in this case, one figure in particular, the so-called father of public relations, the effective inventor of the industry itself, a gentleman named Ivy Lee. And of course, then the Foreign Agents Registration Act comes into force in the 1930s, even though it's kind of barely enforced for decades thereafter. But that's a different story in and of itself. I think what's surprising to me and what was so wonderful about seeing this paper is that even though this is an old, or relatively old phenomenon, very few people have been paying attention to it, especially in the academic space, in terms of these kind of wholesale big data analyses to look at these not only chronological trends at just how much this industry, the PR firms that are working on behalf of these dictatorships, how they have exploded in terms of contract, in terms of what they're actually pulling in, but how these dictators are using these firms in and of themselves. Adam, I wanted to turn to you about some of the findings. Alex just laid out some of the rationale for why these firms might be using this. Was there anything on the finding side that stood out to you as surprising, or I mean, either in terms of reality or just the scale that we're actually talking about?
I mean, the scale is impressive, as already mentioned. Another finding I think that really stood out for us, that it's really across different types of autocratic regimes, we see very little differences in the sense of there are very high levels across the board of authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, autocratic regimes using Western PR firms. So it doesn't matter that much if we're talking or looking at a single party dictatorship or a personalist regime or a regime that's basically a monarchy. All of them used to a very high share these firms, and I think that's quite striking. And another finding I think that really stood out for us was partly driven by a lot of media reports. We were expecting that, if there's one logic that probably really explains the use of Western PR firms and the use of them by dictatorships, then it's really like this countering criticism kind of logic, in the sense of, trying to suppress bad news. Say, if a regime just cracked down, as Alex mentioned, on nonviolent protesters, right? Or if you incarcerate a lot of journalists or something, you get this bad news from abroad, and that you want to counteract, and so you hire these firms, and essentially making sure that you kind of control the damage that is done to your reputation. And I mean, that's going on. We see evidence of this, but actually what we see as well is really this, what we call maximizing publicity kind of logic. And this is really like not just damage control and trying to launder a reputation or whitewash your reputation. It's actually maximizing and promoting essentially the regime you have in place, the rules you have. And what we see is that regimes very strategically and very selectively essentially use, for example, international sports events that they're hosting. They also use inaugurations of like new skyscrapers, right? That are super high and that kind of seem to revolutionize engineering in terms of high buildings. And they would use that as well. And everything you could think of that you can capitalize on in order to promote and show that you're hip, that you're technologically advanced, that you're modern, these regimes will use. And I mean, the international sports events stuff is really like this. That's also how we measure this, right? But it's really what we see really driving the motivation essentially to hire these firms in the West.
Adam, if there is one word that comes to mind when I think of so many of these dictatorships, it is certainly hip. Or maybe not. I don't really know what hip is these days. But Adam, you did make a point just a moment ago about the variety and variation of the regimes that are using these firms. And again, it's all kinds of types, all kinds of typologies. There's a graphic that you guys included in the paper itself toward the end, looking just at the sheer number of contracts with the firms. And the top line findings, the firms that you guys found hiring the dictators that you found hiring the most number of firms are really all over the place, both in terms of type as well as geographic. You have Mobutu in Zaire, you have Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, you have Franco in Spain, all across the political spectrum, all around the world, again, all coming to, in this case, these American firms themselves. One of the questions, and again, this is certainly a space I've been working on in the past, more on the journalistic side than on the academic side, is, and maybe this is beyond the realm of the paper itself, is, are these contracts actually worth it for these dictators? And again, we're talking about hundreds of different contracts over dozens of different firms, dozens of different dictators. There are plenty of case studies you can choose from. This is maybe even an unfair question to ask you guys. Is it worth it for these dictators to go to these firms? We know these firms are making millions of dollars in servicing these dictators and doing this kind of work. But, and I don't want to ask you guys to put yourselves in the shoes of these despots. Is it worth it from their perspective?
Well, so I mean, we do try to measure in the paper some outcomes. It's really tricky, right, to measure whether these things work with any degree of kind of social scientific certainty. It's really, really hard, which is part of the reason you don't see, you don't see too many studies that try to do so. We try to do so in the paper, and I'll let Adam talk about that. But for another project, I took a deep dive into a PR contract that was an award-winning and considered a successful campaign. And that's a contract between a group of firms associated with RacePoint Global and the Rwandan government. And they produced what is now like a well-known, PR, a well-known document. It's a 9-page plan for how to rehabilitate Rwanda's image under Paul Kagame, right? And it talks in extraordinary detail about how the main threat to to Rwanda's image are organizations like Human Rights Watch, which they allege in the document, only kind of make up human rights stories to raise funds and so on. They talk about Kagame as a visionary. They talk about creating rules of engagement and perimeters around discourse when we talk about the Rwandan government and so on. So super detailed report that identifies threats and identifies ways to mitigate those threats and respond to critics. And it won an award from PR Week, apparently. And so, the way they measured impact, on their own terms was kind of placing articles in, prestigious newspapers and clicks and likes and impressions and things like that. And so, there are these plans out there that on their own terms, they're considered successful. The big question for me that comes out of thinking about those kinds of projects and thinking about success is what it walls off. I mean, it walls off a certain amount of ethical consideration when it comes to what kind of clients you take on.
Right. And look, I'm perfectly happy to, I'm very privileged to be in the position I am, perfectly happy to share my kind of unvarnished opinion on the ethics of some of this. Certainly it's in many ways absolutely reprehensible behavior to act as a mouthpiece for some of the most horrific regimes on the planet. And we don't have all time today for me to stand on my soapbox for this. But what reminds me of, Alex, is maybe 15, 20 years ago, and I don't think we've actually talked about this before, and I don't think it was in the paper, but there was an investigative reporter, a gentleman named Ken Silverstein in the United States, who worked for Harper's Magazine, who went undercover posing as a consultant / PR specialist to try to find other firms that would work on behalf of one of the most, again, kind of Stalinist dictatorships remaining at the time, well, continuing to this day, in Turkmenistan. And what he found was firm after firm after firm being more than happy to sign up the Turkmen dictator as one of their clients, and again, to present Turkmenistan as some bastion of stability, of energy security, of reformist, democratizing figures, so on and so forth. And when that publishing came out, there's a great book about it called Turkmeniscam. When that book came out, the scandal wasn't that these firms were willing to sign up one of the most heinous dictatorships on the planet. The scandal was that he went undercover in the first place, and you really saw the PR industry in the U.S. close ranks and go after this reporter, Silverstein, go after his magazine, Harper's, and call him out and not call out the firms themselves. And I wanted to also, Alex, come back to what you just mentioned a moment ago about Rwanda in particular, and to quote one of your previous writings, because you've really been leading this space on Rwanda itself. You said in the past that Rwanda is, quote, perhaps the most successful example of authoritarian image management in the contemporary world. And again, it's not just the Russias and the Chinas or the Irans or the Venezuelas, so on and so forth, these kind of certainly more well-known dictatorships, but it is those even smaller ones, in this case, certainly a savvy one in Rwanda, that has led the charge. And again, the industry seems to be happy to follow the lead of those working on behalf of the Kagame regime itself. Adam, I wanted to turn to you. Was there anything that stood out on your end in terms of the findings? Were there any surprises? Were there any specific case studies that really encapsulated things as you saw it on your end?
Yeah, so thanks. So maybe I have a chance to quickly follow up on what my colleague Alex just mentioned. I think another very interesting anecdote is, for example, the one on the Syrian First Lady, so Asma al-Assad, right? And I mean, if we take just essentially benchmarks and measures that I guess the sector would use, I think it can be described as quite successful, because they managed to place a story in the fashion magazine Elle, and she was it was the same month essentially that the violent crackdowns.
Well, this for context, this is Bashar al-Assad's wife, who had a glossy spread in was it Vogue magazine?
It was Vogue and it was Elle. So in Vogue she was described as the rose in the desert. In Elle she was described the best dressed woman in world politics. And I mean, this stuff came out around the month where we saw this brutal crackdowns, as I mentioned, on the peaceful protests in Syria. So that's by these standards, I guess it was a success. Whether this would really just resonate with people within and outside of Syria, I think we can put a question mark to that. But then, like, zooming out a little bit and going back to our paper, essentially on the cross-cutting systematic evidence that we managed to unearth. And again, Alex pointed already out that it's really difficult for us as researchers to really pinpoint and essentially nail, or we would say scientifically isolate, essentially downstream effects of the hiring of PR firms by dictatorships. But we did try. And so what we found, and I found this like quite interesting as well, and that's why I want to share this. So what we found essentially, and we looked at two potential consequences. So the first one would be just purely political gains, whereas you could also argue, down the line, you might, as a regime, as a dictatorship, might maybe also get like some sort of material benefits. So on the political benefit dimension, I think an obvious measure, and that's what we then took a closer look at, was essentially state visits, right? So if you use a PR firm that is good at lobbying and maybe put out nice reports about you, would that come down to essentially the US Secretary of State visiting you more often, or maybe even the US President? And we did find some evidence for this. So I'm a little bit cautious here. I don't want to overstate this finding because, again, it's difficult to nail this scientifically. But we do see that subsequently, after like regimes hire these firms, it seems that they are more likely that the U.S. Secretary of State pays them a visit. And then we looked in the material benefit dimension. We looked essentially at foreign aid and military aid. And here we find that there seem no benefits to be available or coming around after the regime hired these firms. So it seems to be that at least some political gains can be reaped. What this then does essentially down the line, say if the US Secretary of State really pays you a visit, I don't know, right? That's a question that's still up for grabs, and that we potentially want to answer in the future, Alex.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Alex.
One thing we can say for sure is that whether they work in all cases or not, dictators think they work. So they continue to splash out money for this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we shouldn't forget that, and I think that's coming back to Alex's great work, like the hiring of PR firms in the West. This is essentially one instrument of the whole toolbox of authoritarian image management and also authoritarian control that's aimed towards, domestic control, but also like foreign influence. And so we should also see this essentially as the whole toolbox, one instrument, but the other instruments as well. And, if you want to really go for the downstream effects of this, you would need to consider all the other instruments that they have available as well, which, ranges essentially from very, very soft, super soft campaigns, soft power campaigns, down to really like iron fist transnational kind of repression instruments. And so there's, unfortunately, these regimes are pretty smart in using and retailoring and exploiting actually certain kind of features towards their advantage.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
This is an example of a type of activity that is legal, it's overt, it's reported, it's transparent, you can go look at it. I mean, it kind of makes you wonder what they're doing in illicit, covert, things that are not transparent, right? I mean, this already overt kind of quote unquote legitimate activity is already, it has a lot of shady elements to it.
I was going to say, maybe turning things back to the academic space for a little bit, or at least for this question, one of the things, obviously I'm a huge fan of this paper, of this finding. It is relatively surprising, maybe even more than relatively surprising, that for as much focus as there has been in the the broader commentariat, certainly in the journalistic analytical space, as well as in the academic space, on the phenomenon of foreign interference, both modern as well as historical, in the past 2 years, it really seems like the elements of the area of hiring PR firms and broader image management in and of itself seems like it's just kind of ripe for examination. We haven't seen a lot of resources, a lot of similar papers, a lot of similar investigations in the past. I guess I'm just wondering, maybe again, this is an unfair question to ask you guys, why haven't we seen more examinations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, especially, Alex, what you just said, because it is freely accessible, it is available, anyone can take a look at it. Why haven't we seen more kind of broad-based examinations of FARA and of foreign lobbying efforts in terms of hiring PR firms in the U.S. In the past? I don't know, that question's for either of you.
So I can try and answer. So, the FARA data is great. It's great because it's also very unique in the sense of really trying to capture, the business relationships that are struck between domestic firms and foreign principals, right? But it's also unique. It's really unique. And we don't have anything, as far as I know, comparable for example, in Europe, right? And I think that's a shame, because I think besides the academic interest, as you mentioned, FARA can be accessed by everybody, right? Everybody can look stuff up, which is great. And I think this is exactly the transparency we kind of need in a democratic, open, liberal society, where people then can make up their minds and maybe also hold certain actors accountable, right? And I think specifically, because we're talking of something that is overt, that is semi-transparent, at least when it comes to these business relationships, still we're seeing that these firms do engage in kind of deceptive or manipulative tactics, at least. And so I think it's important for people to know. And I think that's also the reason why we were like, this is the reason essentially, I think, why we wanted to write this paper. We wanted to fill this void that is out there, which we really felt like needed to be filled with systematic evidence. I mean, we have great qualitative evidence on this, but we wanted to look this, with the broad data, cross-cutting, like cross time and space, and quantify essentially the patterns. And we hope we have achieved that, at least, in the first step. There's more to come. But then, that only gets you so far. And if you're interested, say, in Germany, if you're interested in the UK, if you're interested, say, in France, right, there's no data, and there's no systematic data. And then going back to FARA, I think a reason why people, academics and non-academics, haven't drawn on this more is really that despite the systematic collection of the data, it's still quite messy, I can tell you, because we did the work, data work in the back office in order to have a robust analysis run, right? And it takes a certain amount of time and a certain amount of willingness to dig into it. And there's just, they get these sheets, they fill them out, but obviously they don't coordinate in how they do that, right? And I have a hunch that there's not a great willingness to be overly precise and provide more information than what they're actually supposed to, right? And so that complicates the whole data undertaking, right? And it's a heavy digging someone has to do. And let's hope that our research, as the first step, invites follow-up research and other research, motivates other researchers to take a close look as well. And I'm sure there are more patterns to be unearthed and more findings to be shown and demonstrated.
Yeah, I think it's worth, again, highlighting this paper looks only at the American side of things. It's the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S.'s Foreign Agents Registration Act, that these findings, as spectacular as they are looking at. We don't have the Canadian equivalent. We don't yet have an Australian or New Zealand equivalent. Certainly don't have a European equivalent. And I wanted to mention that because you do include in the paper that quote, perhaps now infamous quote from Tony Blair, the former British PM, who'd been hired by the dictatorship, the regime in Kazakhstan, following the killings in late 2011 in Western Kazakhstan. And I just have to read this quote where Blair is recommending to the then dictator Nursultan Nazarbayev to say that Nazarbayev should say, quote, "These events, tragic though they are, should not obscure the enormous progress that Kazakhstan has made." Look, I'll let that quote just sit there in and of itself. We're running short on time. I did want to ask Alex and Adam, if I can, what is coming next in this space? If you guys are able to share anything that listeners and readers should be on the lookout for moving forward, either as it pertains to PR firms in particular or image management more broadly.
Yes. So one of our, we both have kind of various projects. I know Adam has been working quite a lot on sports tournaments and their, whether they improve the image of dictatorships that host them. For this particular project, what we're looking to do next is gather some data from other jurisdictions and try to figure out if some of these patterns obtain, and to also use the FARA data to explore different relationships and different possibilities. So we're kind of in the early days of following up on that. But as you say, Casey, there's so much that can be researched here, and you asked why other people aren't doing it more. And, we could talk endlessly about the sociology and incentives of our discipline and why people publish what they publish. But I mean, I think it's also worth noting that there are some people doing some really interesting research on this and trying to understand from different points of view how authoritarian states are increasing and influencing global politics. And so both of us are kind of working in that area from sort of different angles.
Yes. I mean, I can add I think one question that really is really keeping us busy is could we unearth more information on the firms themselves, right? Firm characteristics and what they boils down to the question of what do they actually provide, which services do they provide the dictatorships or with. And another one that I think we find quite interesting is essentially drilling deeper in terms of regime characteristics. Again, this is the first cut. We try to do this in a very precise and very robust way. But there's obviously more on the regime side as well to be investigated, right? And I mean, you mentioned the differences, Casey, across leaders, and that's definitely something that keeps us very interested and very busy as well. And then on top the sports events, as Alex mentioned, that's something I wanna dig deeper into. And I mean, there are some papers already out. They are actually published. But so I think the combination of, again, talking about the instruments, right? The whole package, essentially the whole toolkit they have available. As Alex mentioned, that's something that the both of us, and also our third person on the paper, Christian Glasel, we are really interested in this. Like, how do they combine? How do they substitute? How do they retailer? And how do they just hijack and exploit certain kind of weaknesses in certain kind of systems for their advantage? I think that's what gets us and really motivates us to keep doing what we're doing.
Well, I suppose I wish there weren't so many avenues to explore and areas to research in terms of how dictatorships use and abuse all these tools in their toolkit to affect not only policy, but again, the broader image, the broader reputations of these regimes themselves, to entrench themselves that much further. But on the flip side of that, I am very happy that the both of you, as well as your colleagues, are looking into this, and I cannot wait to read more from the both of you moving forward in this space. Again, we'll leave a link to the initial working paper in the show notes so folks can read more. And Alex, Adam, it was a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
The Human Rights Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes and protects human rights globally with a focus on closed societies. We promote freedom where it's most at risk in countries ruled by authoritarian regimes.